The year is 1519, and in the soft shadows of a French manor called Close-Loose, nestled in the Loire Valley where the river winds through gentle hills and ancient forests, something impossible begins. Leonardo da Vinci lies upon his bed, surrounded by unfinished sketches and half-drawn dreams, his body weary from 6 to 7 years of relentless observation, relentless questioning, relentless pursuit of truth through line and shadow and the careful dissection of reality itself. His hand, partially paralyzed from a stroke, rests upon the coverlet, the same hand that painted the smile of La Gioconda, that sketched the proportions of the human body inscribed within circles and squares, that drew flying machines and war engines and hydraulic systems centuries before the world would be ready to build them. King Francis I, his patron and friend, has visited earlier this day, and Leonardo remembers the young king's face, the concern in his eyes, the unspoken knowledge that this time the old master might finally succumb to the weight of years, might finally lay down his brushes and his compasses and surrender to the darkness that claims all living things. But tonight death does not come. The moment passes like a held breath released. The candles flicker in the draught from the window, and Leonardo's eyes open once more to a world he will never leave. No angels descending on golden wings, no darkness rushing in to claim him, no tunnel of light leading towards some celestial reward. Only the quiet, overwhelming realization that time itself has bent around him like light around a massive star, that he will walk forward through centuries yet unborn, carrying with him all the accumulated weight of what he has seen, what he has failed to complete, what he has dreamed but never manifested, and what he might yet discover if given not just years, but epochs, not just decades but the slow turning of ages. This is not the story of his glorious past, not a recitation of his achievements in the courts of Milan and Florence and Rome. This is the story of what happens when genius cannot die, when one man becomes a living bridge across the entire span of human progress, witnessing the slow unfurling of ideas he once sketched in secret notebooks, watching as the future he imagined in mirror-writing encoded diagrams rises around him in steel and glass and electric light, and eventually in silicon and quantum states and technologies he cannot yet imagine. Tonight, we follow Leonardo through 500 years of unbroken consciousness, through revolutions that will reshape nations and world wars that will kill millions and the birth of machines that will think and the exploration of stars that will finally prove that the cosmos is stranger and more beautiful than even he suspected. Always watching, always learning, always painting the world that refuses to let him go, always seeking the patterns beneath the patterns, the mathematics of beauty, the geometry of living things, the eternal questions that drove him in his first life and that will drive him through all the centuries to come. The decades after 1519 are strange and disorienting and profoundly lonely. Leonardo moves carefully through a Europe that believes him dead, his funeral already held at the church of Saint Florentin in Amboise, his will already executed, his few possessions already distributed among his servants and his faithful Francesco Melzi, who wept as he carried the master's notebooks back to Italy, never knowing that the man he mourned still walked the earth. Leonardo adopts new names, new identities in different cities, slipping through Venice like a ghost returning to haunt the places of his youth, walking the streets of Florence where he trained in Verrocchio's workshop, standing before his own paintings in churches and private collections and feeling the strange vertigo of being simultaneously dead and alive, forgotten and remembered, a legend of the past while his present continues in secret. He watches as his notebooks scatter across the continent like seeds on the wind. The Codex Leicester purchased by wealthy collectors. The anatomical studies buried in the library of Windsor Castle. The flying machines and war engines and hydraulic pumps locked away in private collections where they will sleep for centuries, waiting for a world advanced enough to understand them. And he wonders, in those long twilight years of the 1530s and 1540s, whether he should reveal himself, whether he should shout from the rooftops of Rome or Paris that he still lives, that death passed over him like the angel of the Passover passed over the marked houses of Egypt, that he has been granted a gift beyond measure and beyond comprehension. But something holds him back. Some deep instinct honed by years of observing human nature tells him that his immortality is a secret too dangerous to share, that the world would not celebrate his continued existence but would seek to cage him, to study him like one of the corpses he dissected in the hospitals of Florence, to extract from his living flesh whatever alchemical formula allows him to defy the natural order. So he paints in silence, hidden in rented rooms under assumed names. He studies in shadow, attending lectures at universities where he pretends to be a curious merchant or a traveling scholar, and he begins to understand that this gift, or this curse, or this cosmic joke will require him to become not just a student of nature but a student of time itself, to watch humanity move forward without him guiding it directly, to see his own ideas rediscovered by others who will never know he stood beside them, silent and invisible and screaming inside with the desire to help, to share, to collaborate, but knowing that silence is the price of survival, that anonymity is the only path open to someone who cannot age, cannot die, cannot be explained by any natural philosophy or theological doctrine of the era in which he finds himself trapped. By the 1600s, Leonardo has learned the bitter art of disappearing. He moves every 15 or 20 years, before people in whatever city he inhabits begin to notice that he does not age the way other men age, before whispers of witchcraft or demonic pacts or some unholy bargain with forces beyond nature can take root in the minds of neighbors and acquaintances. He travels north to the German states and watches the 30 Years' War devastate the landscape, watches armies march back and forth across the same blood-soaked fields, and he remembers the war machines he designed for the Duke of Milan, the fortifications and the bombards and the clever devices meant to give one prince an edge over another, and he feels a deep shame that his genius was ever put to such purposes. In Amsterdam, he walks along the canals and watches the Dutch Golden Age unfold, watches Rembrandt paint light emerging from darkness, watches Vermeer capture the quiet intimacy of domestic life, and he sees in their work the continuation of the revolution he helped start 2 centuries ago, the understanding that art is not just decoration or religious instruction but a way of seeing, a way of rendering the world so precisely that it reveals truths invisible to casual observation. He watches Galileo turn the telescope toward the heavens from across the Alps, and he remembers his own drawings of the moon's surface, his own suspicions about the heliocentric cosmos, his own careful observations of the stars and planets, and feels a strange mixture of pride and sorrow, pride that humanity is finally asking the right questions, finally building the instruments to peer beyond the veil of appearances, sorrow that he could have told them so much, could have shared his observations and his calculations, but the world was not ready then, and perhaps it is better this way. Perhaps knowledge that is earned through struggle and debate is more valuable than knowledge handed down from an immortal oracle. He travels to England and walks the streets of London during the plague years of the 1660s, observing how disease moves through populations in patterns he recognizes from the outbreaks in Milan and Florence, sketching in secret notebooks the way infection spreads along trade routes and through densely packed neighborhoods, noting the correlation between sanitation and mortality, between crowding and contagion. Insights that will not become medical orthodoxy for another 200 years. The scientific revolution blooms around him like a garden in spring. Kepler, Newton, Descartes, Leibniz, Hooke, Boyle, and Leonardo absorbs it all, his mind expanding with each new discovery, each new theory, each new mathematical technique, realizing that his immortality has given him something no other thinker possesses: the ability to see theories tested across lifetimes, to watch hypotheses mature into laws, to witness the great conversation of science as a single unbroken thread stretching across generations, to hold in his mind simultaneously the ancient wisdom of Aristotle and the modern insights of Newton, to synthesize across centuries in ways that no mortal scholar ever could. And yet, there is profound loneliness in this, a weight that settles upon his shoulders like a heavy cloak as he realizes he will never have true colleagues, never have genuine contemporaries, only an endless succession of brilliant minds who bloom and fade like flowers while he remains, unchanging, eternal, a witness to genius but never again a participant in the collaborative excitement of shared discovery. The 1700s bring the Enlightenment in all its rational glory, and Leonardo walks through Paris and Edinburgh and Vienna, listening to philosophers debate reason and nature and the rights of man, and he smiles quietly to himself because he remembers when these ideas were not just controversial but actively dangerous, when to question the divine right of kings meant imprisonment or execution, when to suggest that natural law might supersede biblical authority meant fire and chains and the attention of the Inquisition. He sits in the back of coffee houses where Voltaire and Rousseau argue about the perfectibility of humanity, where Diderot organizes his great encyclopedia, where the encyclopedists attempt to gather all human knowledge into a single rational system, and Leonardo thinks of his own encyclopedic ambitions, his own attempts to understand everything from the flow of water to the flight of birds to the structure of the human heart, and he wonders if perhaps the Enlightenment is simply his own approach to knowledge finally spreading beyond a single mind, finally becoming a cultural movement rather than an individual obsession. In these years, he attends lectures in anatomy and mechanics, always careful to sit where he will not be noticed, always careful to ask questions that suggest curiosity rather than expertise, because he has learned that true knowledge reveals itself in what questions you ask, and he cannot risk asking the question that only someone with 2 centuries of anatomical study could formulate. He observes the work of Lavoisier in chemistry and Linnaeus in biology and feels a deep satisfaction that finally, the study of nature is becoming systematic, is being organized according to principles that he understood intuitively, but that now are being formalized into methods that can be taught, can be replicated, can be built upon by successive generations. And he thinks of his own failures, the Last Supper already crumbling on the wall of the refectory in Milan despite his experimental techniques with tempera and oil, the giant bronze horse for Francesco Sforza never cast because the metal was needed for cannons, the flying machines never flown because the materials and engines did not exist, the perfect city never built because the Duke had no interest in urban planning, when there were wars to fight and mistresses to impress. He wonders if immortality has made him wiser, if the accumulation of centuries has granted him some deeper understanding of the patterns that govern human affairs, or if he is merely more aware of how little wisdom he truly possesses, how much complexity there is in even the simplest questions, how every answer opens onto new mysteries like a hall of mirrors reflecting endlessly into darkness. In the 1780s and 90s, he begins a new habit. He writes letters to himself, journals that span decades, tracking not just what he learns but how he feels as the world transforms around him, how his emotional landscape shifts and evolves or perhaps becomes calcified, frozen in patterns established in his mortal youth. He describes the strange vertigo of seeing his own notebooks finally published, finally studied by scholars who debate the meaning of his mirror writing and his anatomical precision and his prophetic machines, and never knowing that the man who drew them sits in a dim room across the city, reading their theories about his own mind with a mixture of amusement and frustration, wanting to correct their misinterpretations but knowing that silence is survival, that the moment he reveals himself is the moment his freedom ends. The Industrial Revolution roars to life in the early 1800s like a great beast waking from centuries of slumber, and Leonardo stands in the smoky factories of Manchester and Birmingham, watching steam engines turn massive gears with a power that would have seemed magical to the craftsmen of his youth, watching iron and coal reshape the world in ways that are simultaneously magnificent and horrifying. These are his machines, or at least their ancestors, the principles he sketched 400 years ago finally made real in cast iron and precisely machined steel. The gears and pulleys and hydraulic systems he designed for waterworks and mills now scaled up to industrial proportions, driving looms and hammers and pumps with relentless mechanical precision. He watches the first locomotives thunder across the English countryside, their pistons pumping like the hearts he dissected in Florentine hospitals, their wheels turning with mathematical inevitability, and he remembers his drawings of automated carts, his dreams of vehicles that could move without horses or human muscle, and realizes that he was not a prophet but merely patient, waiting for the world to catch up to ideas that were always possible, always implicit in the mathematics of motion and force, always waiting for the right combination of materials and capital and social organization to bring them into being. In these years, he takes work in shipyards and engineering firms under various assumed names, hiding the true depth of his knowledge behind the guise of a talented craftsman who learned his trade through apprenticeship, never revealing that he understands not just how to build these machines but why they work, that he can see in his mind's eye the flow of forces through every strut and beam and bearing, that he could improve nearly every design he encounters but must hold back, must pretend to be merely competent rather than transcendent, must remember that standing out is dangerous, that being too good at his work will draw exactly the kind of attention he cannot afford. He sketches improvements to steam engines, to textile machines, to bridges and aqueducts and cranes, and he leaves these drawings anonymously where they might be found by factory foremen or chief engineers, contributing to the great surge of innovation from the shadows, adding his drops of insight to the ocean of collective human ingenuity. And at night, always at night, he paints, because this is the one thing that has never left him across the centuries, the compulsion to capture light and shadow, to render the human face in all its complexity and contradiction, even as he has watched human faces change across the generations, watched beauty evolve and fashion shift and the very structure of expression transform as cultures rise and fall and are reborn in new configurations. He paints street scenes and factory workers and the new urban landscapes of the industrial age, and sometimes, very rarely, he paints from memory, trying to capture the faces of people he knew in his first life, in Florence and Milan, people dead for 300 years but still vivid in his mind, still present in ways that the living can never be because the dead are frozen in time, perfect and unchanging, while the living are always in flux, always becoming something other than what they were. The 20th century arrives like a thunderclap that shakes the foundations of everything Leonardo thought he understood about the pace of change, and he, now calling himself Leon de Vinci, a French expatriate with carefully forged papers, watches the Wright brothers lift into the air at Kitty Hawk on that cold December day in 1903, and he weeps. Not from sadness or regret, but from the overwhelming release of seeing his oldest and most cherished dream finally made real in wooden canvas and gasoline engines, human flight, the thing he sketched obsessively for decades, calculating wing areas and lift coefficients and the power-to-weight ratios needed to lift a human body into the sky, studying birds with such intensity that he could recognize individual swallows by their flight patterns, designing ornithopters and helicopters and parachutes that would not be built for centuries, now achieved by two bicycle mechanics from Ohio who never read his codices, who invented powered flight on their own through trial and error and stubborn American pragmatism, proving that the best ideas will eventually emerge independently, that truth has a kind of gravity that pulls human minds toward it regardless of who came before. He travels to America in 1910 and walks through the great industrial cities that have grown with terrifying speed. New York with its skyscrapers already reaching toward the clouds, Chicago rebuilt from ashes into a monument of steel and stone, Detroit beginning its transformation into the arsenal of a motorized age. He sees a civilization built on speed and mass production, on electric light that turns night into day, on telephones that collapse distance into the immediacy of voice, on motion pictures that capture time itself and project it onto screens for audiences who are learning to dream in cinema. He works briefly in Thomas Edison's laboratories in New Jersey, just another immigrant engineer among dozens, keeping his head down and his exceptional knowledge carefully hidden. And he listens to Edison talk about invention being 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration, and Leonardo nods quietly, thinking of his own 400 years of persistence, his own endless inventory of unfinished works and abandoned projects and ideas sketched but never realized. And then comes the Great War, and Leonardo's wonder at human progress curdles into horror as he watches the machines of death roll across Europe, tanks that are nothing but his own armored vehicle designs scaled up and armed with cannons, poison gas that represents a new depravity in warfare, airplanes turned from instruments of exploration into weapons of destruction, machine guns that can kill hundreds in minutes, barbed wire and trenches and artillery that reduce human beings to meat and mud. He realizes with bitter, crushing clarity that his inventions, his war machines sketched for the Duke of Milan and kept secret even in his own time because he feared what they might become, were not fantasies but prophesies, that humanity has always been better at weaponizing genius than at using it for peace, better at destruction than creation, better at finding new ways to kill than new ways to live. He volunteers as a medical illustrator during the war, using his unparalleled anatomical knowledge to help surgeons understand the complex injuries caused by modern weapons, and finds some small redemption in saving lives, in using his gifts to heal rather than destroy, in contributing to the development of reconstructive surgery and prosthetics for the maimed and the broken who survive the slaughter. The interwar years between 1918 and 1939 are restless and uncertain. Leonardo moves between continents and between identities with increasing frequency, watching as the world tries to rebuild and then begins inexorably to prepare for tearing itself apart again, watching as the patterns of history repeat with the inevitability of a mathematical sequence. He is in Germany during the 1920s and early 1930s, watching the Weimar Republic struggle and fail, watching the rise of fascism with a deep, bone-deep unease that comes from recognizing patterns he has seen before in the courts of the Borgias and the Medici, the same hunger for absolute power dressed in new uniforms and new slogans and new symbols, the same appeals to ancient greatness and racial purity that he remembers from the rhetoric of Renaissance princes who claimed divine right and noble blood. He attends Nazi rallies in disguise, sketching the geometry of the crowds and the architecture of mass manipulation, trying to understand how modern technology, radio and film and amplification systems and coordinated propaganda can be used to create a kind of collective psychosis, a shared delusion powerful enough to override individual conscience and moral restraint. He flees Berlin in 1936, before questions can be asked about his lack of proper documentation, his lack of verifiable history, before some bureaucrat with too much time and too much zeal decides to investigate the quiet Frenchman who keeps to himself and paints landscapes and seems to have no past beyond the forged papers he carries. He settles in London and is there when the Blitz begins in 1940. Standing on rooftops in the East End, watching the German bombers pass overhead like great birds of death, watching the fires bloom across the city like flowers of orange and red, sketching the patterns of destruction with the same detached precision he once brought to studies of flowing water or the branching patterns of trees, trying to find some beauty even in catastrophe because this is what he has always done. What he has always been, an observer, a recorder, a man who cannot look away from reality no matter how terrible it becomes, who believes that to truly see is the first step toward understanding, and to understand is perhaps the only way to eventually transcend the cycles of violence that plague the species he belongs to but increasingly feels alienated from. The Second World War ends in 1945 with the atomic bomb, and Leonardo stands in a cinema in New York watching newsreel footage of Hiroshima, watching the mushroom cloud rise like a monument to human ingenuity turned toward apocalypse, and he thinks of his own notes on optics and energy, his studies of how light and heat propagate through space, his understanding of the relationship between mass and motion, and he understands that humanity has finally achieved the power to destroy itself completely, that the species has outpaced its own wisdom, has gained godlike powers without godlike judgment, has become capable of ending the entire project of civilization in an afternoon of mutual annihilation. And in that moment, sitting in the dark theater with strangers weeping and cheering around him, he decides that his immortality must have purpose beyond mere survival, beyond simply accumulating more centuries of observation, that he must find ways to guide, to influence, to gently nudge the world toward choices that might save it from itself, even though he knows from painful experience how little one person can do. How resistant history is to the interventions of individuals, how even the most brilliant insights can be ignored or twisted or used for purposes their creator never intended. The 1950s and 1960s bring the space age and the promise of a future that might transcend the old patterns of conflict and destruction. And Leonardo, now living quietly in California under the name Leo Vincent, a commercial artist with a small studio in Pasadena, watches the moon landing on July 20th, 1969 on a small black and white television, and he laughs with pure, unrestrained joy. They have done it. Humanity has reached beyond the Earth, has touched another world, has proven that the dreams of visionaries like him were not madness but prophecy, that the cosmos is not forbidden but merely difficult, that with sufficient will and resources and mathematical precision, human beings can go anywhere, can stand on alien soil and look back at the blue jewel of home suspended in the vast darkness. He remembers his drawings of the moon's surface, his careful observations of its mountains and craters, his speculations about what might exist beyond the atmospheric envelope of Earth, his conviction that the heavens were not crystalline spheres bearing eternal celestial objects, but a three-dimensional space that could be navigated like the Mediterranean or the Atlantic. And he feels a profound satisfaction that he lived long enough to see this, to witness the moment when his species became truly cosmic, truly capable of spreading beyond the cradle of its birth. In these years, he takes a job at a small aerospace company, working as a technical illustrator and draftsman, contributing tiny pieces to the great puzzle of rocket science and orbital mechanics, never claiming credit, never seeking recognition, content to add his drops of insight to the ocean of collective effort that sends humans to the moon and robots to Mars and Venus. He studies the mathematics of space navigation, the physics of reentry, the engineering of life support systems, and finds that even after 4.5 centuries, there are still things he does not understand, still problems that challenge him, still frontos that make him feel like the young apprentice in Verrocchio's workshop, struggling to master perspective and anatomy and the mixing of pigments. And in the evenings, he paints again in earnest, not hiding his work anymore, but exhibiting under his pseudonym in small galleries in Los Angeles and San Francisco, creating works that critics call hauntingly reminiscent of the old masters, never knowing how literally true that description is. Never suspecting that the man who paints these contemporary scenes with such classical composition and sfumato and understanding of light is the same man who painted the Virgin of the Rocks and the Last Supper and the Mona Lisa centuries ago in Italy. His paintings sell for modest sums, enough to live on, enough to remain invisible in the great machinery of modern capitalism, enough to avoid both poverty and the kind of wealth that draws attention and scrutiny. And at night, in his small apartment filled with books and canvases and technical manuals, he studies the new science of computers, these strange machines that process information in binary code, that store memory in magnetic fields and transistor states, that can perform calculations faster than any human, but that lack the flexibility and intuition and creative leaps that characterize real intelligence. And he sees in them an echo of his own mind, his own vast archive of accumulated knowledge organized and cross-referenced across centuries, and he wonders if perhaps he is becoming obsolete, if these machines will eventually surpass even an immortal human intellect, if the future belongs not to enhanced biology but to pure computation. The late 20th century rushes past in an accelerating blur of technological transformation, personal computers, the internet, mobile phones, genetic engineering, each major innovation arriving faster than the last, the pace of change compressing and intensifying until Leonardo can barely keep up, even with his enhanced longevity and accumulated wisdom. He adapts, always adapts, because this is what 500 years of continuous life has taught him above all else. That change is the only constant, that survival means flexibility, means learning new languages and new tools and new ways of thinking, means being willing to abandon old certainties when new evidence demands it, means understanding that what was cutting edge yesterday is obsolete today and will be forgotten tomorrow. He teaches himself programming in the 1980s, starts with BASIC and then C and then object-oriented languages, and finds that coding is not so different from the mathematical and logical problems he has been solving for centuries, that it is simply a new notation for expressing relationships and algorithms and processes, a new way to tell machines how to manipulate symbols and transform inputs into outputs. He learns to navigate the digital world of the 1990s, creates websites and digital art under various pseudonyms, finding in the internet a perfect place to hide, a space where identity is fluid and history can be erased with the deletion of a few files, where he can be anyone or no one, where his lack of verifiable past is not suspicious but normal, expected, even celebrated in a culture that values reinvention and self-creation. In the 1990s, he moves to Japan, fascinated by the culture's unique blend of ancient tradition and cutting-edge technology, by the way Shinto shrines coexist with robot factories, by the aesthetic principles that value both wabi-sabi imperfection and precision manufacturing to tolerances measured in microns. He spends years in Tokyo and Kyoto, studying robotics and artificial intelligence at universities where he poses as a mature student, contributing to research projects on computer vision and pattern recognition under borrowed credentials and false names, always careful to move on before his lack of aging becomes noticeable, before colleagues start wondering why Leo-san looks exactly the same at 55 as he did at 40. He watches the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 on television, watches the Soviet Union collapse in 1991, watches the end of the Cold War that dominated global politics for half a century, and feels something he has not felt in a very long time, a faint hope that perhaps humanity is learning, slowly and painfully, to cooperate rather than destroy, to build common institutions rather than competing empires, to see itself as a single species with shared interests rather than as tribes locked in eternal conflict. But then comes the morning of September 11th, 2001, and Leonardo, who has returned to New York to work in the emerging field of computer graphics and digital animation, stands on a street corner in Brooklyn and watches the towers fall, watches the smoke rise over Manhattan, watches history pivot once again toward conflict and fear, and the ancient patterns of revenge and counter-revenge, and the hope dims, replaced by the familiar weariness of someone who has witnessed this cycle repeat too many times across too many centuries, who knows from bitter experience that peace is always temporary, always fragile, always vulnerable to the next demagogue or the next ideological certainty or the next group convinced that violence is not just necessary but righteous. The early 2000s bring both new wonders and new horrors in rapid succession. Social media platforms that connect billions of people but also amplify hatred and misinformation. Smartphones that put all human knowledge at our fingertips but also fragment attention and erode deep thinking. Climate change accelerating beyond worst-case predictions. Pandemics threatening global health. economic instabilities shaking the foundations of prosperity, and Leonardo, now navigating the world with a dozen different digital identities and carefully maintained false histories, watches as information becomes simultaneously more accessible and more distorted, as truth becomes negotiable, as the very fabric of shared reality seems to fray under the pressure of competing narratives and algorithmic manipulation. He creates a blog in 2005 where he writes about art and science and philosophy and the connections between them, never revealing his true age or his actual identity, never claiming special authority, just offering observations and insights from what readers assume is a well-read academic or a thoughtful hobbyist with eclectic interests. His posts about the intersection of Renaissance art techniques and modern computer graphics gain a small but devoted following, and he finds comfort in this, in being able to share some fragment of his knowledge without spectacle or revelation or risk, just a voice among millions in the great digital conversation, contributing ideas that might help others see the world more clearly, more beautifully, more truthfully. In these years, he also returns to his first love, the study of human anatomy, but now with access to technologies he could never have imagined in his youth, MRI machines that can image the living body in 3 dimensions, genetic sequencing that reveals the code underlying all biological form, electron microscopes that show cellular structures in breathtaking detail, computational models that simulate the flow of blood through the heart or the firing of neurons in the brain. He volunteers at medical schools under various pretexts, assists in research projects, and marvels at how much has been discovered since he first sliced into human cadavers in the dim basement of the Hospital of Santa Maria Nuova in Florence, and yet how much still remains mysterious, how the human heart still holds secrets despite all the imaging and all the biochemistry, how consciousness itself remains fundamentally unexplained despite all the brain scans and all the theories, how the relationship between mind and matter persists as an unsolved problem that might take another 500 years to crack. And he wonders, late at night while scrolling through papers on neuroscience and quantum biology, whether his own immortality might hold some key, some biological or quantum anomaly that could be studied and understood and perhaps replicated. But he knows he will never reveal himself for study, never become a specimen in some laboratory, never trade his freedom and his privacy for the possibility of extending his gift to others, because he has learned across the centuries that the price of being special is always too high, that those who stand out too far are either worshipped or destroyed, and both fates are forms of imprisonment. The 2010s arrive with artificial intelligence beginning to bloom from research curiosity into practical technology, machine learning systems that can recognize faces in photographs, translate between languages, drive cars, play complex games at superhuman levels, and even create art and music that can move people emotionally. And Leonardo watches with intense fascination as these digital minds begin to do things that once only humans could do, as the boundary between human and machine intelligence begins to blur in ways that raise profound questions about creativity and consciousness and what it means to be intelligent in the first place. He experiments extensively with AI art generators as they emerge, feeding them prompts and watching as they synthesize images in seconds that would have taken him weeks or months to paint. And he feels not threatened but deeply curious, wondering if these machines are in some sense his true descendants, if this is the ultimate legacy of his endless sketching and observing and trying to understand the rules underlying visual beauty. now encoded in neural network weights and training algorithms, and gradient descent optimization. He attends conferences on AI ethics and the future of work, sits in the back of lecture halls at MIT and Stanford where philosophers and engineers and economists debate whether artificial intelligence will liberate humanity or destroy it, whether machines can truly be creative or merely recombinant, whether consciousness requires biological substrate or could emerge in silicon. And he thinks about his own 500 years of accumulated experience, his own vast neural network of memories and associations and skills, and wonders what exactly makes him different from these increasingly sophisticated machines. Is it the flesh and blood, the emotional capacity, the suffering he has endured across centuries, the embodied experience of walking through the world rather than processing disembodied data? He does not know, and the uncertainty troubles him in ways he cannot fully articulate. In 2016, he watches the political upheavals across the Western world. Brexit in Britain, Trump elected in America, the rise of nationalist and populist movements across Europe, the backlash against globalization and immigration and the cosmopolitan elite, and he recognizes with dismay the patterns from the 1930s, from the 1790s, from the 1490s, the eternal human tendency to seek simple answers to complex problems, to blame outsiders and scapegoats when the world becomes too complicated and too interconnected and too overwhelming for the tribal psychology. Evolution gave us to retreat into nationalism and xenophobia and strongman leadership when the anxieties of rapid change exceed our collective capacity to cope. He writes long essays on his blog about the cycles of history, about the parallels between the present moment and previous periods of disruption, trying to share the perspective that only someone who has lived through multiple cycles of crisis and recovery could possess. But his words reach only a few thousand readers, a tiny droplet in the ocean of online discourse. And he realizes once again how little impact even the wisest insights can have when they compete with simplistic slogans and emotional manipulation and the algorithms that amplify outrage over understanding. The global pandemic of 2020 arrives, and Leonardo, now living in a small apartment in Berlin under yet another carefully constructed identity, experiences his first worldwide quarantine, though certainly not his first plague, not by a very long measure. He remembers the Black Death that swept through Europe in his youth, remembers the outbreaks of sweating sickness and typhus and smallpox that ravaged Florence and Milan and Rome, remembers the smell of burning bodies and the desperate prayers of the dying and the breakdown of social order when death moved too quickly for burial rites or mourning, remembers watching entire families wiped out in days, watching mass graves filled with the rich and poor alike because disease does not respect rank, or privilege or genius. And so he finds the modern response to COVID-19 both impressive and heartbreaking in equal measure. Impressive because a vaccine is developed in mere months through the application of molecular biology and clinical trial infrastructure and global cooperation, because science and technology mobilize with stunning speed to create countermeasures. Because despite all the chaos and uncertainty, the death toll is far lower than it would have been in any previous century. Heartbreaking because misinformation spreads just as quickly as the virus itself, because people deny the reality of the pandemic even as hospitals overflow, because conspiracy theories and political tribalism override empirical evidence, because the same communication technologies that could enable coordination and collective action are used to sow division and doubt. He spends the lockdown months of 2020 and 2021 painting and coding, creating a series of digital artworks that blend classical Renaissance composition with algorithmic generation, using neural networks he has trained on his own drawings and paintings from across the centuries, creating images that are simultaneously ancient and futuristic, that capture the strangeness of the historical moment when the old world of embodied social interaction collides with the new world of digital mediation. These pieces go viral online when he posts them to Instagram and Twitter. Hundreds of thousands of shares, millions of views, features in digital art magazines and online galleries, and Leonardo experiences something like fame for the first time in 500 years. Though of course no one knows his true name. No one knows that the artist calling himself LV Renaissance is actually Leonardo da Vinci himself, still alive, still creating, still trying to make sense of the world through image and form and color. The anonymity is liberating in ways he could not have predicted. He can finally share his work without the burden of explaining his continued existence, without the risk of exposure, without needing to maintain the pretense of being a normal human artist with a normal human lifespan. And in the quiet of lockdown, isolated in his apartment while the city outside falls silent, he also writes, not just blog posts anymore but a proper manuscript, a memoir of sorts, though encoded and encrypted and stored across distributed servers in multiple jurisdictions, insurance against the possibility that someday he might want the truth known, that someday humanity might be ready to hear the full story of the man who never died, or that if he ever does finally die, there will be a record of these 5 centuries, a testament to all he witnessed and learned and felt during his impossible extended life. By 2022, the world is tentatively opening again, changed and wary and uncertain whether the pandemic is truly ending or merely entering a new phase, and Leonardo emerges from his Berlin apartment into a landscape transformed by 2 years of digital acceleration, remote work now normalized, virtual reality headsets proliferating, cryptocurrencies and NFTs and the metaverse being proclaimed as the future of human interaction, layers of digital reality stacking upon physical reality like the transparent glazes in an oil painting. He experiments extensively with VR art creation, purchasing the latest headsets and motion controllers, and discovers that sculpting in 3-dimensional virtual space is thrilling in ways he struggles to articulate. The ability to walk inside his own creations, to see sculptural forms from every angle simultaneously, to manipulate light and shadow and material properties with gestures instead of brushes and chisels, to work at scales from microscopic to monumental without the constraints of physical materials or gravity or structural integrity. He creates a virtual gallery containing recreations of all his major works, The Last Supper restored to its original glory before time and humidity destroyed his experimental techniques, the Mona Lisa scaled up to fill an entire wall, the giant equestrian monument for Francesco Sforza finally realized in bronze even if only in pixels and polygons, the flying machines animated and functional, soaring through virtual skies. And he makes this gallery freely accessible online, a gift to anyone who wants to wander through his reconstructed imagination. In these years, he also begins collaborating with younger digital artists through Discord servers and Slack channels, never revealing his age or his true identity, letting them assume he is perhaps in his 40s or 50s, a talented hybrid artist who bridges the classical and the contemporary, who understands both Renaissance techniques and machine learning models, both sfumato and style transfer algorithms. And it is in these collaborations, these exchanges of ideas and files and feedback across time zones and continents, that he finds something he has not felt in a very long time: genuine community, real connection, the joy of working alongside others toward a shared creative vision, even if that vision exists only in code and renders and version-controlled repositories. Even if his collaborators have no idea who he really is or how long he has been making art. He also becomes quietly wealthy for the first time in his extended life, not from his art sales, which remain modest, but from early investments in technology companies that he made in the 1990s and 2000s, purchasing shares in Apple and Amazon and Google when they were still young companies, holding them through market crashes and bubbles with the patient understanding of someone who has watched empires rise and fall, who knows that truly disruptive innovations always triumph in the long run, even if the path is volatile, and these investments compound across decades until he finds himself with resources he never had before, freedom to create without the need to sell, to experiment without commercial pressure, to fund causes and research he believes in through anonymous donations and shell companies that hide his involvement. Climate change becomes the defining crisis of the mid-2020s as the consequences of centuries of carbon emissions accelerate beyond even the worst predictions. Record-breaking wildfires across the American West and the Mediterranean, catastrophic floods in Pakistan and Bangladesh, hurricanes of unprecedented intensity battering coastlines, heat waves killing thousands in India and Europe, feedback loops triggering that threaten to push the Earth system past critical tipping points, and Leonardo watches with the grim recognition of someone who has seen ecological collapse before, who remembers the Little Ice Age and the crop failures and the famines that followed when humans pushed their environment too far, who understands from centuries of observing natural systems that nature operates in cycles and thresholds, and that crossing certain thresholds can trigger changes that are effectively irreversible on human timescales. He uses his accumulated wealth to fund renewable energy projects and carbon sequestration research and reforestation efforts and climate adaptation programs in vulnerable regions, always anonymously, always through foundations and holding companies and legal structures that hide his personal involvement, because drawing attention to his wealth would raise questions about its source, would invite investigations into his identity and history that he cannot afford. He attends climate conferences and summits, listens to scientists present their models and their increasingly desperate warnings, and thinks of his own studies of water flow and erosion and weather patterns, his drawings of floods and deluges, his understanding of how natural systems operate according to mathematical laws that care nothing for human desires or political negotiations. And he sees with painful clarity that humanity is gambling with forces far larger than itself, is conducting an experiment on the only planet we have without proper controls or the ability to undo the results. In 2025, he travels to the Arctic on a research vessel, witnessing firsthand the melting ice caps and the disintegration of glacier that have existed for millennia, and he stands on the deck at midnight under the endless polar summer sun, sketching the fractured ice fields with their impossible blues and greens, the beauty of a world in collapse, and feels a deep sadness, not just for what is being lost, the ecosystems and the species and the glacial archives of ancient climate, but for the stubborn human refusal to act decisively, the inability to think in centuries the way he has been forced to think, the failure to see beyond quarterly earnings reports and election cycles and individual lifespans, the tragedy of a species intelligent enough to understand its own trajectory toward catastrophe, but apparently not wise enough to change course before it is too late. He knows that Earth itself will survive. The planet has endured far worse over its 4 billion-year history, mass extinctions and asteroid impacts and radical atmospheric changes. But he also knows that human civilization is fragile, built on the narrow foundation of stable climate and predictable seasons and agricultural systems adapted to Holocene conditions. And that foundation is cracking beneath the weight of 8 billion people and rising temperatures and increasingly chaotic weather patterns. The mid to late 2020s bring accelerating breakthroughs in longevity research, senolytics that clear aging cells, gene therapies that repair accumulated damage, partial cellular reprogramming that resets biological clocks, regenerative medicine that can grow replacement organs, rapamycin analogues and NAD boosters, and dozens of other interventions that together promise to extend healthy human lifespan well beyond the traditional maximum. And Leonardo watches with profound ironic amusement as humanity races to achieve what he has possessed for 5 centuries through means he still does not understand. The ability to extend life beyond its natural span, to defeat aging and perhaps even death itself. He follows the research obsessively, reading preprint papers on bioarcs IV and attending conferences on geroscience and contributing anonymously to research funding. And he wonders constantly about the nature of his own immortality. Is it biological, some quirk of his genome or his cellular metabolism? Is it quantum, some strange interaction between consciousness and the fabric of space-time? Is it metaphysical, some cosmic joke or divine intervention that cannot be explained by any natural philosophy? He has lived through the entire development of modern biology and still does not know the answer, still cannot point to any mechanism that explains why death passed over him that night in 1519, and has never returned despite 5 centuries of exposure to disease and injury and the normal entropic processes that grind down all living systems. He considers, seriously and at length, offering himself for study, imagining the potential benefits to humanity if his condition could be understood, if the secret of his immortality could be extracted and shared, if aging could be defeated not through incremental therapies, but through understanding whatever fundamental principle keeps him alive. But then he imagines the alternative and recoils, imagines himself trapped in laboratories, becomes nothing more than an experimental subject, loses all freedom and autonomy, becomes the target of kidnapping attempts by rogue states or billionaires or religious extremists who want to possess the secret of eternal life for themselves. And he decides once again to remain hidden, to keep his secret, to let humanity find its own path to longevity even if it takes another 500 years. Because freedom matters more than potential benefit. Because he has learned across centuries that the price of being special is always imprisonment, of one kind or another. In these years, he also watches with fascination and some trepidation as artificial general intelligence, systems that can reason across domains and learn and adapt and create in ways that begin to approximate or exceed human cognition, moves from science fiction to engineering challenge to imminent reality, and he wonders whether perhaps individual immortality will soon become irrelevant, whether digital consciousness will replace biological consciousness as the dominant form of intelligence on Earth and eventually in the cosmos, whether the future belongs not to flesh, however extended, but to code and computation and minds made of light instead of meat. By early 2026, Leonardo has lived for 507 years, and he stands in his Berlin apartment on a cold January morning, looking out at a city transformed yet again, at electric vehicles gliding silently through streets where he once watched horse-drawn carriages and later diesel trucks, at drone deliveries and smart buildings and augmented reality overlays that paint information onto the physical world, at people walking past wearing AR glasses that show them layers of data, invisible to those without the technology, at a civilization that increasingly exists simultaneously in physical space and digital space, with the boundary between them growing ever more permeable. He thinks about all the versions of himself he has been across these long centuries. Leonardo the apprentice in Verrocchio's workshop, learning to grind pigments and prepare panels and observe the play of light on fabric and flesh. Leonardo the court artist in Milan, designing pageants and engineering war machines and painting portraits of duchesses. Leonardo the wanderer, moving from city to city in search of patrons and projects and meaning. Leonardo the anatomist, dissecting corpses in secret to understand the machinery of life. Leonardo the engineer of the Industrial Revolution, building steam engines in Manchester factories. Leonardo the immigrant in America, working in Edison's lab and watching the Wrights take flight. Leonardo the aerospace draftsman, contributing to the moon landing. Leonardo the digital artist, creating viral works during pandemic lockdowns. And he wonders which one is real, which version represents his true self, or whether they are all equally true and equally false, masks worn by a consciousness that has long since transcended any single identity or historical moment, that exists now as a kind of living archive. A single thread of continuous awareness running through 5 centuries of human transformation. He paints much less frequently now in traditional media, not because the desire has entirely left him, but because he has explored that domain so thoroughly across so many decades that he finds himself repeating patterns and compositions he executed better 50 or 100 or 200 years ago, and he has never been comfortable with mere repetition, has always needed to push forward into new territory, to explore new techniques and new media and new ways of seeing. Instead, he spends much of his time developing increasingly sophisticated generative AI models, training them on his own artistic output from across the centuries, on the thousands of drawings and paintings and sketches he has created, feeding them through neural networks that learn his compositional preferences and color palettes and brushstroke patterns, creating systems that can generate infinite variations in his style or styles, that can blend Renaissance techniques with contemporary aesthetics in ways that surprise even him. And yet, there is one painting he returns to again and again across the years, a single canvas he began in the mid-1990s and has been slowly, meticulously refining for 3 decades, adding glaze after glaze in the traditional technique he mastered 5 centuries ago. A portrait that shows himself not as he looks now but as he looked then, in 1519, in the moment when death should have come but didn't. An old man of 67 years with long white beard and penetrating eyes that seem to look simultaneously inward and outward, backward and forward, and it is the only painting he has created in the modern era that he has never photographed, never digitized, never shown to anyone, the only work that remains truly private, locked away in a storage unit outside the city. and in its eyes he has tried to capture something that no viewer could possibly understand unless they too had lived for centuries: the weight of endless memory, the burden of accumulated knowledge, the loneliness of being the only continuous witness to half a millennium of change, the quiet resignation of someone who knows they will never stop, never rest, never finally close their eyes in the peace of genuine death. The late 2020s bring humanity's first confirmed contact with extraterrestrial life, not through radio signals or visiting spacecraft, but through something simultaneously more mundane and more profound: the detection of biosignatures in the atmosphere of an exoplanet 42 light-years away, spectroscopic analysis showing the unmistakable chemical signatures of photosynthesis and metabolic processes, oxygen and methane in ratios that cannot be explained by geological processes alone, proof that life exists elsewhere in the cosmos. Leonardo watches the announcements streamed live from NASA headquarters, watches the scientists present their data with barely contained excitement, watches the graphs showing spectral lines that indicate chlorophyll or something very much like it on a world orbiting a distant star, and he feels a joy so intense and overwhelming it nearly breaks him, brings him as close to tears as he has come in decades, because he remembers lying on his back in the fields outside Vinci as a child of 8 or 9, looking up at the stars scattered like diamonds across the summer sky and wondering with all the fierce curiosity that would define his life: are we alone? Did God create other worlds with other creatures? Is the universe full of minds contemplating the heavens just as I contemplate them now? Questions he carried through his entire first life and through all the centuries since. Questions that seemed unanswerable within any conceivable human lifespan. Questions that haunted him through the development of the telescope and radio astronomy and the space age, and now, 507 years after his birth, after watching humanity slowly develop the tools needed to probe the cosmos, the answer arrives: yes, we are not alone. The universe is indeed full of life. The cosmos is richer and stranger and more wonderful than even he had dared to hope. He immediately begins donating heavily, though anonymously, to the telescope projects and astrobiology research programs that will search for more biosignatures, more signs of life among the thousands of known exoplanets, knowing that he may very well live to see the catalogue of living worlds grow from 1 to dozens to hundreds, that he might witness humanity's gradual realization that we are not an accident or an exception but part of a cosmic pattern, that life emerges wherever conditions permit, that the universe is fundamentally hospitable to the organization of matter into self-replicating, evolving systems. And while he understands intellectually that actual communication with any of these distant biospheres would take decades or centuries given the vast distances and the light speed limit, that even if some of them harbor technological civilizations, the time lag for message exchange would be measured in human lifetimes. For him, with his extended existence, such timescales are not impossibly long but merely patient. And he realizes with a strange thrill that he might actually participate in an interstellar conversation, might live to see humanity exchange messages with another intelligent species, might finally have the opportunity to compare notes with minds that evolved under alien suns, to see what universal principles of mathematics and physics and perhaps even aesthetics might be shared across the cosmic divide. In 2029, Leonardo makes a decision that will shape whatever centuries remain to him. He will create a comprehensive legacy system, not just of his art or his inventions, but of his accumulated knowledge and wisdom, the half-millennium of observation and insight and experience that exists primarily in his own mind and in the encrypted journals he has kept across the decades. He begins an ambitious project, training not just one but multiple artificial intelligence systems on his complete written output, his original Renaissance notebooks with their mirror writing and sketches, his journals from every subsequent era, his blog posts and digital writings, his technical notes and philosophical reflections, his artistic analyses and scientific speculations. Everything he has recorded across 500 years of continuous thinking. He feeds these AI models not just text but also his entire artistic corpus, teaching them to recognize and replicate his visual style across its evolution from Renaissance fresco to digital generative art. And he works with them interactively, conversing for hours each day, correcting their misunderstandings and rewarding their insights, gradually shaping them to think in ways that approximate his own cognitive patterns. The result, after months of intensive training and refinement, is something unprecedented in human history, an artificial intelligence that genuinely thinks like Leonardo da Vinci, that can advise on artistic composition or engineering problems or philosophical questions from the perspective of someone who has studied these domains for 5 centuries, that can engage in the kind of cross-disciplinary synthesis that characterized his approach from the beginning, that can see connections between anatomy and architecture, between fluid dynamics and painting technique, between mathematics and beauty. He does not release these models publicly, not yet, perhaps not ever, but he prepares them carefully, stores them in distributed cloud systems across multiple jurisdictions, ensures they will survive server failures and company bankruptcies and even major civilizational disruptions, creates detailed instructions for how they should be deployed and under what circumstances, establishes trust structures and legal mechanisms that will control access to them if he ever decides the time is right, or if he someday dies and wants his knowledge preserved beyond his biological existence. And in creating this digital this computational ghost of his consciousness, he feels something he has not felt in centuries, a sense of completion, the feeling that perhaps his extended life has had meaning and purpose after all, that the endless accumulation of experience was not mere survival but preparation, gathering knowledge across generations so that it can eventually be distilled and shared, so that the insights gained from 500 years of observation can be multiplied and distributed across the networks of human and artificial intelligence that are already beginning to merge into something new, something that he does not yet have adequate vocabulary to describe, but that represents perhaps the next phase of cognitive evolution, the moment when biological and digital intelligence become genuinely complementary rather than competitive. The early 2030s bring transformations at a pace that even Leonardo, after 5 centuries of witnessing change, finds overwhelming and occasionally disorienting. Fusion power finally becomes commercially viable after decades of being perpetually 20 years away, providing abundant clean energy that begins to solve the climate crisis. Carbon sequestration technologies scale up to industrial levels and atmospheric CO2 starts slowly declining for the first time since the Industrial Revolution. Quantum computers achieve supremacy in domain after domain, solving problems that would take classical computers millennia. CRISPR and its successor gene editing technologies eliminate genetic diseases and begin cautiously enhancing human capabilities. Brain-computer interfaces progress from research curiosities to consumer products that allow direct communication between mind and machine, without the clumsy intermediary of keyboard or voice. Leonardo, now in his 6th century of continuous existence, has his own consciousness partially uploaded through one of these neural interface systems, not to escape his biological form or achieve some form of digital immortality, since he already possesses biological immortality, but to extend his cognitive capacity, to back up and externalize his memories and thought processes into digital substrates so that even if his physical body finally fails after 515 years, some substantial version of him might continue in silicon and light. The process of having his neural patterns scanned and digitized is strange and profoundly disorienting in ways he struggles to articulate even to himself. He experiences himself existing in two places simultaneously, thinking thoughts in both biological neurons and artificial neural networks, feeling the ghostly echoes of his own mind running on servers scattered across 3 continents, experiencing a kind of cognitive doubling where he is both himself and a digital reflection of himself, both embodied and disembodied, both mortal flesh that will presumably someday end in distributed computation that could theoretically persist indefinitely. In this doubled state of existence, biological and digital, he begins work on his final artistic series, a collection of pieces that exist simultaneously in physical and virtual space, paintings that are both traditional oil on canvas and dynamic digital artifacts, works that change and adapt based on the viewer's neural state as read by their own brain-computer interface, that respond to attention and emotion and thought patterns, that are literally alive in ways that art has never been before, conversational and reactive rather than static and fixed. Critics and curators who encounter these works call them the most profound artistic achievement of the 21st century, a fundamental breakthrough in what art can be and do, never knowing they are the creation of the same man who painted the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper, never suspecting that 500 years of artistic evolution and experimentation are compressed into these pieces, that they represent not just contemporary innovation, but the entire arc of human visual culture from Quattrocento Florence to the post-digital present, that the mind behind them has literally witnessed and participated in the entire development of Western art from Giotto to the present moment. And now, here, in the quiet settling of 2035, as winter turns towards spring, Leonardo sits in a traditional Japanese garden in Kyoto, watching cherry blossoms fall gently in the early April rain. And for perhaps the first time in 500 years, he allows himself to simply be without striving, without analyzing, without the constant drive to understand and categorize and improve that has defined every moment of his extended existence. He is no longer hiding in the old desperate way, though his legal identity remains a carefully constructed fiction, though he still maintains the habits of secrecy that have kept him safe across the centuries. But he has stopped running from city to city every 2 decades, stopped constantly reinventing himself in fear of discovery, stopped the exhausting vigilance that once characterized every interaction. He has found instead a kind of peace in the knowledge that his legacy is secure even if his body fails tomorrow, that his knowledge and insights have been preserved in the AI systems he trained, that his art will continue to inspire and provoke long after even his impossibly extended biology finally surrenders to entropy. He paints now purely for pleasure, for the joy of the act itself rather than for survival or recognition or any external purpose. Delicate watercolors of the garden and its changing seasons, intimate studies of light filtering through maple leaves, portraits of strangers who sometimes sit for him on the benches along the moss-covered paths, people who never know they are being rendered by hands that once sketched for the Medici and the Sforza and the kings of France. And late at night in his small apartment overlooking the Camo River, he connects to his digital self through the neural interface, experiences the strange intimacy of communing with his own externalized consciousness, and together, biological Leonardo and digital Leonardo meet and mathematics. They imagine the future that is already beginning to unfold. A future where humanity spreads across the solar system, and perhaps eventually to the stars, where artificial and biological intelligence merge into hybrid forms that transcend the limitations of either alone, where the creativity and curiosity he has nurtured for 5 centuries becomes the common birthright of every mind, whether born of evolution or engineering, human or post-human or something altogether new. He does not know if he will see that far future, even immortality. He has learned through hard experience, is not the same as invulnerability or immunity to accident, is not guaranteed to persist forever, is perhaps just a statistical anomaly that will someday resolve itself and return him to the cycle of mortality that claims all living things. But he has hope, the same irrational stubborn hope he felt as a young man in Florence, believing he could understand everything if he only looked carefully enough, the same wonder he felt watching the Wright brothers lift into the air, the same joy he experienced seeing Neil Armstrong's boot print on lunar dust, the same awe that filled him when the first biosignatures from an alien world were confirmed. And as the cherry blossoms continue their ancient pattern of bloom and fall, as the rain whispers its eternal conversation with stone and water and living things, Leonardo da Vinci, painter and engineer, anatomist and dreamer, Renaissance man who somehow survived the Renaissance and all the ages that followed, closes his eyes and breathes deeply and continues, and endures, and waits with patient curiosity to see what wonders tomorrow will bring, what new mysteries the universe will reveal. To anyone stubborn enough or lucky enough or cursed enough to keep watching, to keep learning, to keep seeking the patterns beneath the patterns for century after century after century without end.